by using data, you can get any result that you like. Statistics and econometrics is a form of rhetoric. It's actually making an argument, but there are many elements of the argument which are hidden, parts of reality which is not observable in the data. And by making assumptions about how this hidden reality works, I can change the picture. If I start out with some preconception about how increasing GDP leads to lowered infant mortality, I can prove this hypothesis, or I can prove the opposite. By choosing the right reference countries against which to benchmark, I can make the performance of Pakistan look very good, or I can make it look very bad. The same data can be made to fit a lot of different stories. The causal relationships are in the story and not in the data. And of course, econometrics tell you that the relationship is in the data and not in the story.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, economist, social scientist, and former Vice-Chancellor of the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, Professor Asad Zaman. And in a moment, we're going to be talking to him about econometrics. If you're new to modern monetary theory, you might want to check out our first 3 episodes for a basic introduction, or our episode 126 for a more intermediate level introduction. But if you want to dive in here, let me start with a conjectural history of economic thought. It probably began in ancient times when a slave noticed that there didn't seem to be a very equitable distribution of stuff and wondered out loud if it was because some people were bad at sharing. And this idea started to spread among the general population. And the emperor at the time, obviously wanting to get to the bottom of the drivers of wealth inequality, set up the world's first think tank to look into it. And they crunched the numbers and they found that it had nothing to do with anyone being bad at sharing. It turned out that the wealth distribution of the time was a function of everybody rising to a position which they wouldn't have risen to unless God had wanted them to be there. And these primitive research rituals evolved over millennia into today's economics tradition with its much more sophisticated analysis that the wealth distribution of our time is a function of some people being worth more than others as determined by an infinitely rational market. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, surely there must be real sources, historical documents, recorded testimony that can tell us some actual facts about how economic thought developed. And looking at those might perhaps be a better way to figure out what happened, rather than just imagining what happened. And I'm sure there are sources, but I don't need them because I'm doing a conjectural history. Also, I can't be bothered to look. Anyway, if this seems like a questionable approach to developing an understanding of how things work, I agree. And this is the same approach that orthodox economists, the ones that write the textbooks, take to understanding money. Because we weren't there when money was first invented and no one wrote down how it happened, we just have to make something up. And the textbook story is that money was invented to simplify barter. There's nothing more to it than that. So essentially, we're still in a barter economy. And therefore, now we can get on with the real work of economists, which is perfecting markets so that we can figure out who gets their own spaceship and who has to suffer and die. But what if we didn't have to make up a story? What if we were living in a world where central banks were bothered enough about how the money they spend comes into being to write studies about it, and commercial banks were also quite touchy about who's got which amount of money because that's kind of their job? And what if the whole money system itself turns out to have been recording its own history all along because it's actually a set of interconnected spreadsheets brought into existence by legislation and run by obsessive bean counters? I mean, if we were living in a world like that, it'd be easy to see that money is a creature of states and laws, and it'd be possible to study those laws, and we'd perhaps have the person in charge of, say, the US government's banking system on national television in 2009 saying that when they want to spend, they simply use a computer to mark up bank accounts. We'd all see quite clearly that the dollars and pounds and yen and whatever else we use as money these days are typed into existence with a computer keyboard. And that would mean that currency issuing governments can't by definition run out of money. And that would mean that poverty is a policy choice that could be unchosen with the stroke of a pen. And economics textbooks would be teaching this instead of regurgitating myths about how humans have an innate desire to truck, barter and exchange, and that's how money got invented. And then we could raise a generation of problem solvers that could actually fix the hellscape we've left them. Now, I know that's all a bit pie in the sky because, as my conjectural history of economic thought proves, humans also have an innate desire to make up stories about why inequality is sad but necessary, and that's how Larry Summers got invented. But ultimately, it's like that old story my conjectural grandfather used to tell me. You know the one, that inside us all there are two think tanks. One takes an evidence-based approach to how governments spend and proposes real solutions to save lives and the planet. And the other think tank tortures data until it fits the preferred narratives of rich people. And I remember as a child, I always used to ask, but Grandpa, which think tank will win? And he always used to laugh and say, the one with the banging podcast, mate. Anyway, just before we dive in, a quick announcement that our friend and regular guest, Dr. Dirk Entz, is running a week-long MMT and European macroeconomics course at Maastricht University on the week commencing 22nd of August, and the deadline for applications is the 1st of August, and so I've linked to details about that in the show notes for this episode, along with links to various pieces of work from today's guest, Professor Asad Zaman, and our episodes detailing government spending and monetary operations, and as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in.
Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pina.
And we're honored to be joined today by economist, former Vice-Chancellor of the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, writer and social scientist, Professor Asad Zaman. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor.
You're most welcome, and thank you for inviting me.
Professor Zaman, because you've had an amazing career and because it's our first time talking, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to MMT.
Well, I was trained. I got my bachelor's in math from MIT and went on to do a PhD in economics at Stanford. So it was a long journey to realize that all of that education that I had received was really more brainwashing than learning. And since then, it has been a long journey to learn that basically a capitalist education is designed to produce human resources, interchangeable parts in a machine for the production of wealth. So it irons out all your individualities and peculiarities and turns you into a standardized part. And the education also includes the indoctrination that this is the best thing for you. As Karl Marx said in a very insightful remark, that capitalism exploits laborers not by force, but by making the laborers believe that that is the best for them. And so basically, capitalism makes us believe that the best thing that we can do with our lives is to sell them for money. And that's really a tragedy because our lives are much more precious than all the gold in the planet that can buy. And one of the theories to basically unwrap all of these lies that we are programmed to believe, we have to understand the economic system which drives the world. And MMT is a very important part of unraveling the deceit that we have been programmed to believe.
Can you remember a point in your reading where you came across an MMT-like concept? Did it go back a long way in your standard reading? Because sometimes we talk to people who studied standard neoclassical texts, and it was a very hard leap for them to make to get the MMT lens.
The first clue that I got was some 10 years after graduate school when I was reading about Paul Byrok, and his book is called Some Myths and I've forgotten the title. But anyway, it went through historical episodes and showed that some of the central beliefs that I had been programmed to believe were contradicted by history. And then when I asked my professors about it, they said, no, our theories are true. One of the examples was that free trade led to depression in Europe. So when I asked the professor, he said, no, we don't need to look at history because our theories are true by default. This is not exactly what you said. This is what I'm paraphrasing. Because if the assertion is that free trade led to depression, then our answer would be that if we didn't have free trade, the economy would have gone even worse. So our theories are immune to being disproven because everything depends on alternative reality. You say that an economic theory is bad. It means that if you had followed some other theory, you would have gotten better results. But since no one knows what would have happened if you followed a different policy, then you are automatically protected. If you ideologically commit yourself to believing that our theory produces the best of all possible worlds, there's no way to disprove that, because if you say that if we had done this or if we do that, it will result in a better world, you're always making a comparison with a conjectural counterfactual. And that is something which nobody can ever assert with certainty. So basically, neoclassical is completely immune to being disproven. Once I realized that, I said that this is propaganda and not science.
So they build a kind of fortress, an ideological fortress that cannot be contested.
Exactly. Some things are axiomatically true, and there's just no way to say that they are wrong.
So your specialism is econometrics?
That's correct. That's what I did my PhD on.
And you also wrote a very important textbook called Statistical Foundations for Econometrics Techniques, which is a very important textbook for universities. But a lot of our listeners will not have an understanding of what econometrics is. And I think I could have a go at saying that maybe econometrics is simply statistical techniques applied to economics, but maybe you have a better definition.
Yes, I would say that it's high wizardry done to deceive people, because basically econometric models are built on hidden assumptions. And the hidden assumption is actually very simple. Basically, we assume that what happens tomorrow will be similar to what happened yesterday. So basically, if you see a sequence of 1,000 sunrises, then you can confidently predict that there will be sunrise again tomorrow. But also, of course, the chicken who sees that the owner feeds it every day is entitled to predict that I will not be slaughtered tomorrow for my meat, but doesn't happen. And just like the global financial crisis took all the econometric models by surprise, in fact, some people went further to say that these econometric models were partly responsible for the global financial crisis, because basically one important element of this, what happened in the crash, was the automatic trading algorithms, which use sophisticated regression analysis to predict how the stock market will behave and use that to do trading in microseconds. And when the real world didn't fit within their models, and they started racing around to make trades very fast, when in fact the world was not behaving according to the theory. So that was one of the elements which led to the crash. Another element was that the econometric models and theory misled economists into confidently rejecting all those people who said that something is happening that's wrong and there's a potential crisis. There's a very famous incident of Ravi Batra, who brought up the problem at a high-profile meeting with Lawrence Summers, and Lawrence Summers dismissed the whole idea that, no, with rational expectations, you can't have a crash like the one that happened.
In your work, you write about three major mistakes which were made in developing the foundations of the social sciences in the West. Could you tell us about those three mistakes?
I would say that to understand my current views, there's this poem by Robert Burns on would the Lord the gifty give us to see ourselves as others see us. So basically, the understanding to which I have arrived is a very non-Eurocentric world of view of the world. So you have to step outside your shoes and the European shoes, which we are all trained to believe. Basically, a Western education trains us to be Eurocentric in our ways of thinking. So to look at it from an outsider's perspective, you have to just step into shoes of an alien civilization, as it were, and understand that what happened in Europe was that a century of religious warfare between Catholics and Protestants led to disenchantment with religion and sort of the necessity of creating an alternative to religion. Because what is religion? Again, this term has been redefined to mean a personal belief system, whereas the original meaning for religion is a way of life. It's an all-encompassing thing which tells you about all forms of social behavior. In Europe, due to the rejection of Christianity, due to a century of really disastrous and extremely violent and bloody warfare, the necessity arose to create political theory, economic theory, social theory, all on non-religious foundations. And so basically, this is what secular modern thinking is. It's supposed to be rational, objective, based on facts and logic only. But in fact, one cannot describe human lives or describe social forms, economics, politics, without moral assumptions. And this is one of the key, I think this is the foundational error. I've described the three mistakes, but those are more higher level. At the foundation level, the idea that we can construct knowledge which is relevant for our human lives without discussing the goal of our lives, why we live, what are things worth living for, what are things worth dying for, without discussing purpose of life, you cannot describe how societies should be constructed, how we should behave. So the pretense was made, and so this is one of the defects, that what we are doing is science. What we are doing is describing laws of behavior, and we are just describing, we are not actually prescribing. But this is one of the fundamental mistakes, that what is actually a prescription is sold as a description. So normative frameworks, this is what should be done. We should have perfect competition. We shouldn't have any restraints on trade.
So the assumption that human beings are utility maximizing agents, you're saying that is a prescription as opposed to a description?
Absolutely, absolutely. This is one of the most disastrous and toxic prescriptions that we read, that rational behavior consists of maximizing utility. It tells you what your goal of life is. Your goal of life is to consume the maximum amount of goods and to get the maximum amount of pleasure from them. This is really a horrendously bad goal of life for anyone.
And we've touched on this, but you write that a drastically mistaken understanding of the nature of science known as logical positivism, even though this philosophy was later proven wrong, foundations of modern economics have not been revised and they continue to be based on principles of logical positivist philosophy. Can you tell us what logical positivism is?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because actually there's a Wikipedia article called Getting to Philosophy, and it shows that if you take any Wikipedia article and click on the first link, and you keep doing this, you will eventually get to an article in the philosophy section. So basically, although we do not realize it, all of our knowledge is built on philosophical foundations. And this logical positivism is one of the most deadly philosophies invented by mankind. And basically, it came as a result of the allergy to religion developed in Europe because of the justified outrage against immoral behavior by popes and high-ranked clergy. And they were indulging in a life of enormous luxury while preaching austerity to the masses. And this kind of hypocrisy really first led to the Reformation with the Protestant breakaway, and then eventually to loss of faith. That this kind of Christianity, which just the great deviation between actions and preaching was wrong. So anyway, after rejecting Christianity, the idea arose that, and there was this great battle between science and religion, and this battle led to a centuries-long attempt to prove that science is truth and religion is just an illusion, a deception. And logical positivism, which is a philosophy which emerged in early 20th century, actually purported to prove this, although the proof was later found to be defective. But basically they said that knowledge can only be built on the basis of observations and logic, and to oversimplify it much, science is based on observations and logic, but religion is based on assumptions which are about afterlife and God and day of judgment, which nobody has ever seen. So it means that this is not part of knowledge. In fact, logical positives went further and said that if you talk about unobservables, this is just meaningless nonsense. So basically, they declared that religion is meaningless nonsense and science is the only form of knowledge. So this was the foundation for social science. Now, one of the critical problems that with this philosophy is that what you feel in your heart is also completely unobservable to me. And similarly, what I feel in my heart is also unobservable to you. And so these things have to be excluded. Our feelings have to be excluded from scientific domain. And in some sense, you can say that if I say I'm feeling sad, this is meaningless nonsense. And this is exactly what behavioralist psychology was developed on the basis of. It said, Skinner said that we have to move beyond freedom and dignity. That was the title of his book. And we have to look at behaviors which are observable and not worry about what my father did to me when I was a child and how it traumatized me for life. These things, he said, were nonsense. All of Freudian psychology was thrown into the garbage. And while some of it justly belongs there, there are some insights there that are useful also. But anyway, the point is that when you removed the feelings from the picture, which is what economists did, then the idea that some needs are more urgent than others, that feeding a child, giving a child milk is more important than listening to music, this idea cannot be expressed in neoclassical language, because all we're talking about is choices. The baby chooses to have milk, the man chooses to listen to music, and this is all that we can observe. The fact that one of the needs is urgent and the other one is not something that is directly perceivable. So the central idea of economics was changed. Lionel Robbins developed the modern definition of economics based on scarcity in the early 20th century, rejecting an earlier definition which can be called the material welfare approach, which discusses about how consuming goods improves our welfare. It improves our health. It improves our satisfaction with life. So even though that's not the deepest level of contentment, it still has some connection with our lives. But when you get to choices and when you fail to differentiate between needs and wants, then you've really abandoned any claim to relevance to human lives and any claim to being important for studying human welfare and how economics can help better human lives. And so this was abandoned, and that's why we see the world in the state that it is, with billions being hungry, while a handful of people have more resources than half of the planet. And the amount of money needed to take care of basic needs of all the people on the planet is very, very small relative to the resources which are available. So the idea of scarcity as being the fundamental concept of economics is also wrong. There is no scarcity when we look at needs.
So now turning to econometrics, Patricia's been studying neoclassical economics. She's just done her master's, so she's very familiar with this stuff, but I'm not, and I think a lot of our audience might not be. Would it be possible to explain to a layperson what regression analysis is?
It would be useful to understand where it started from. Basically, Sir Ronald Fisher was trying to prove the superiority of the white races, and he was trying to show that the genes of the superior races are transmitted to the youth. And so he studied the relationship between the heights of the children and the heights of the fathers, because that's observable. What he really was trying to get at was the IQ, the intelligence, and generally the unobservable great qualities of the white races. He himself had 6 or 7 children because he thought he was part of this elite class and he felt it was his duty to propagate it. So he was very disappointed by the results because it turned out that the children of tall parents are generally not as tall as their parents. And this is what he called regression towards the mean. Even though the person who is very distinguished, his child is not as distinguished. But running the relationship between two variables, whether it's the father's height or the children's height, or whether it is the GNP per capita and the weather, trying to find the relationship between variables, this is the goal of regression analysis. However, the methodology which is used is so mechanical that it automatically always leads to nonsensical results. And that's something that is well known but never mentioned. The way that econometrics textbooks get over this problem that nearly every regression, which is the basis of all economic policy being made today, is nonsense. The way that the economic textbooks get over this is that they start by one chapter devoted to the assumptions of the regression model, which they list. Okay, is assumption 1, assumption 2, assumption 3, assumption 4, assumption 5. These are all technical and complicated. And then they forget about it. They never mention that when you're doing data analysis, you're supposed to check to see if these assumptions are valid. And whenever anyone does so, they find that they are all, or many of them are wrong and not valid. And therefore, the whole regression analysis is not valid. And so this is the case for nearly all regression analysis, that they are based on assumptions which are known to be false. But these regression results are being published in thousands and thousands, maybe even millions of articles all over the world, because that's the only technique that is available. So that's what regression is all about.
So you mentioned earlier as well that one characteristic flaw of the use of regressions, of econometrics in economics, is that once it finds relationships within variables, so correlations, it assumes that these correlations continue into the future. Would you say that that is particular to economics, or would it happen to all the sciences that use these types of analysis?
Basically, the issue is whether you have causation or you have correlation. You see, if a causal relationship, if I do X and this causes Y to happen, then I can predict that this will continue to happen in the future because this is a causation relationship. But a correlation does not have the same predictive power. Now, the whole philosophy of how to differentiate between correlation and causation got ultimately messed up with David Hume, because again, this has to do with empiricism and the idea that we can only trust what is observable. So Hume's rejection of religion also led him to rethink about hidden things. Now it turns out that causal relationships is hidden. And this is what the famous observation of Hume, that you can observe constant conjunction. You can observe that one thing follows another thing, but you cannot observe the causal relationship. That's deeper, that lies at a deeper level. So you can observe that the rooster crows and then you see the sun rises, but did the rooster crowing cause the sun to rise? This is something which cannot be learnt from the observations. When you hit a ball and it goes into the pocket, it hits another ball which goes into the pocket. Did the first ball hitting the second cause the other ball to move? Or is it just an accident? One event happened first and the second one happened later. Now it's possible to disentangle, and we all know intuitively, we understand the difference between correlation and causation, but philosophers have been going at this problem for centuries without any clear resolution. In fact, I've recently written a paper or a blog post about how babies understand causation much better than philosophers do. Child development studies show that babies are able to differentiate between correlation and causation, even though philosophers haven't figured this out. So this is a fundamental problem which faces not just econometrics, but in other areas as well.
In your writing, you contrast a nominalist methodology with a realist methodology. Could you tell us about those two things?
Nominalist refers to the name, and basically it refers to the idea that the economists or the econometricians are only supposed to look at the observable, the surface appearances, and they're not supposed to go beneath to dig at what is happening in the real world, which is hidden from observation. It's just like, I can look at your face and I can deduce that you're sad if your lips are downturned, but I can't look into your heart. And so the positivist philosophy says that what's in the heart doesn't matter. The only thing which matters is what I can see. And so if I see downturned lips, then I'm entitled to conclude that you're sad, and there is no other meaning to sadness different from what appearances can reveal. So this is a crucial mistake, and that's what nominalist philosophy mistake that makes. There are many, many examples where statistical analysis leads to false conclusions. So there's a famous example of the Berkeley admissions paradox, in which they studied the admissions ratios at Berkeley, and they found that there is discrimination against females in the sense that the percentage of applications of females being accepted was low and the percentage of male applicants being accepted was high. So that's what the numbers tell you. But now, basically, you can play all you want with numbers and you will never learn about discrimination. What I'm assessing in a realist approach to econometrics, which is not available in any textbook currently, is that you have to go and ask the admissions committee, and you have to look into the hearts of the people in the admissions committee and ask, are they actually biased against females? And are they actually trying to admit more males into the program? Without looking into the heart, you cannot tell. Exactly the same data is compatible with the hypothesis that there is discrimination, and also with the hypothesis there is discrimination against males and against females. And I've constructed such examples where whether or not there is discrimination depends on aspects of reality which the data will not reveal. Basically, that's the key idea.
To bring it home in your writing, you highlight a problem with the way regression analysis is used by using an example of the relationship of GDP per capita in Pakistan to infant mortality. Could you tell us about that?
Basically, by using data, you can get any result that you like. So if I start out with some preconception about how increasing GDP leads to lowered infant mortality, I can prove this hypothesis, or I can prove the opposite, or I can prove that there is no relationship between the two. It depends, you see, on benchmarking. If I look at the relationship between GDP and infant mortality in Pakistan, and I want to say that Pakistan has done well, I have to compare it with others. So by choosing the right reference countries against which to benchmark, I can make the performance of Pakistan look very good, or I can make it look very bad, or I can make it look neutral. So basically, what I have come to realize is that statistics and econometrics is a form of rhetoric. It's trying to persuade others, but it's concealed that I'm actually making an argument, but there are many elements of the argument which are hidden, which are parts of reality which is not observable in the data. And by making assumptions about how this hidden reality works, I can change the picture. So one way to think about it is to say that the statistics pretends that there is no narrative, no story being told, but actually the inferences that we make depend hugely on the story that we tell. So if I tell you that, look, Pakistan in the 60s was underdeveloped, and then we had market reforms, and the country started progressing, and look how the GNP has been increasing, and look how the infant mortality has been going down. So within a story, the data makes sense. Now, the same data can be made to fit a lot of different stories. The causal relationships are in the story and not in the data. And of course, econometrics tell you that the relationship is in the data and not in the story. So once you understand it this way, then you can understand that we can create our own stories, and we can change the relationship according to the story.
Yeah. So say an economics student, if they want to understand how a piece of data fits within a realist approach, would you suggest that the story in this case, I guess, would be the political background or the actual human interactions going on around that data? Would that be a better approach?
Yes. Let's say that you're trying to think about infant mortality in Pakistan. So you have to have a target. What are you trying to understand? Okay, so I'm trying to understand infant mortality. Then, instead of gathering data on different series and running regressions, which is what econometrics teaches you to, go into the field and ask, why do children die? Go to the hospitals, go to the villages. And so you'll find that in Pakistan, a large proportion of the infant mortality is due to unattended out-of-hospital childbirths. So then you ask, why do people not take their children to hospitals? Is it because of there are fewer hospitals? Or is it because there are some cultural ideas which lead people to have home births more? Or are there other factors? So all of this requires going into the world and looking at what is really happening. And you cannot sit at your desks and juggle time series data to find out the causes of infant mortality in Pakistan. That's what I mean by real econometrics.
So it's really interesting from the course that I did and experiences of other students. I got the feeling that students are very much encouraged to focus on data analysis as a key skill.
Exactly.
And any sort of political analysis or historical analysis of events, it's an add-on, but it's not seen as a fundamental skill of students.
Absolutely. I think you're right that this is a great mistake, that it is not an add-on. This learning the story behind the data is central to understanding, and data analysis without knowing the story can and does lead to grave mistakes.
I really like this idea that it's storytelling, and it reminds me of something that I think I heard Howard Zinn talk about a while ago. He's no longer with us, unfortunately, but he said something about it's impossible to present something in an unbiased way.
Absolutely.
The fact that you have a newspaper, let's say you own the newspaper, the fact that it's of finite length and there are infinite facts in the world means that you're going to have to make an editorial choice about what to put in that newspaper. And those choices are based on things that you think, attitudes that you have. So it's impossible to have, for instance, an unbiased newspaper, an unbiased news source. And I think that it very much connects up with what you're saying about econometrics.
Yes, exactly. What you're saying is fundamental, that basically our priorities, which are always normative, govern what we discuss, what we analyze. The data that we have today, for example, in the World Bank series, there are 7 different series for GDP per capita, how much wealth the aggregate a nation has. But if you want to find out how many poor people there are, how many hungry people there are, which are much more important things to know, you can't find it, because nobody considers that data to be worth having. Or actually, it's important for the richest people of the world to keep that data concealed and hidden. So you can't actually learn about these numbers.
So you write that the fundamental weakness and flaw in the nominalist methodology is that it stops at displaying a pattern and mistakes patterns for laws.
Basically, yes, all of this econometrics and regression analysis, you can say, looks for patterns in the data and extrapolates them. This is ridiculous, because what you need to do is to look for causes, but causes are not there in the data. They are in the structures of reality which are hidden beneath the data. So you have to look at the relationship between what is happening in the real world and how this is being reflected in the numbers. So, for example, if somebody is intelligent, this will be reflected in IQ scores, but to say that the IQ square is the intelligence, that is the nominalist mistake, to confuse the indicator with the reality. That is what nominalist philosophy does, and that's really a huge mistake, and this has had devastating impact. Today, businesses all over the world say that if you can't measure it, then you can't manage it. And this is a massively wrong thing. What happened as a result in universities is that people started counting the number of publications that professors make, because that you can measure. You can't measure quality. And so professors started putting out lots of garbage and increasing their publication count. And this is the sad case all over the world today, because people are trying to manage by numbers. Now everybody is aware that their salary depends on, and their promotion depend on the number of articles they put out. So they just print a lot of garbage. Our journals have come up to accept this garbage and to make it appear like it has high citation index, and all of the indicators are there, but the thing that you're looking for underneath the reality is not there. And so basically, when you manage the numbers, you only get the numbers. You don't get the reality underneath.
You talk about normal distribution, and you're right. Most real-world data sets are not normally distributed. Now we have the computational power required for their analysis, but the theory is still stuck in the pre-computer era.
At the time of Sir Ronald Fisher, who invented statistics, there was no way to look at 1,000 data points. So he was very clever. He invented this idea that if the data is normal, that's a technical assumption. If the data satisfies a certain hypothesis that he made up, then only two numbers are needed to understand the data. And those are the mean and the standard deviation. So that allowed him to do analysis of any number. Even if you have a million data points, if you just get these two numbers for them, then you understand the whole data set. And that basically made it possible to do data analysis in an era where there were no computers. Today, I can take 1,000 numbers and plot every single one of them and look at them on my Excel spreadsheet. And so this methodology is no longer necessary, but it has become so deeply embedded in the framework of statistics that people continue to do this without realizing that they are adding an arbitrary assumption made due to the need for analyzing data sets without computers. And now we no longer need this hypothesis, and we can directly analyze the data without adding on extraneous and false assumptions. Econometrics is also another example of this, but all of modern statistics is based on this false assumption.
So the normal distribution effectively assumes that data is randomized and that there is no bias in the data. So are we saying that for most data collected out there, there is, for a set of data, 1 million points, is very likely that it will be biased in some way. So it will be skewed towards one side of the data so that it's not random data.
Basically, what happened after Fisher was that normal distribution was extended to a large class of distribution. There's a whole books called Statistical Distribution Theory. Basically, Fisher reduced the normal distribution, but then there were many other distributions, the gamma, the Pareto, the chi-square, etc., Poisson. So what people generalizing, building on Fisher's work, they said that data doesn't have to be normal. It can be in any one of these 1,000 distributions, and we can still analyze it. But what if none of those 1,000 distributions is correct? And that is reality. The real data is too complex to fit any theoretical preconception. You have to do it directly. Then the conventional statistics is helpless because they start by assuming that the data belongs to something nice, some nice distribution. But the real data doesn't belong to any theoretical preconception that you have about it.
I don't know if this is getting too technical, but you talk about how a fundamental misunderstanding of the role and importance of p-values in statistical research, which persists to this day, and that there is real damage inflicted by these misguided statistical procedures.
Yeah, this is actually a theme that has been pursued by two economists, Ziliak and Deirdre McCloskey. They have a whole book on this, and they have basically, if you administer a drug to a patient and they are cured, usually you have some statistical variation. I mean, not all the patients are cured. So you need to know whether the drug administered worked or whether it was just a chance. Maybe the patient just got cured and you happen to have administered the drug. So again, this is an issue which is distinguished between correlation and causation. You have a cold, you take medicine, and your cold goes away. So was it caused by your taking the medicine, or was it just accidental correlation? So to distinguish, there is this technique which is called the p-value, which basically relies on sufficient number of repetitions. But what is sufficient? That is exactly, the p-values allows you to calculate. It says that, okay, if in 5,000 trials, 5,000 people took the drug and 4,000 of them got cured, then that's pretty strong evidence. And if only 1,000 of them got cured, then that's not enough. So there's a critical point cutoff that, okay, if it's more than 3,700, then we will say that this has a significant p-value and we'll say that this drug works. And if it's less than 3,700, then we will say that we can't be sure whether it's the drug or whether it's accidental. The real details are a bit technical. So the point is that this p-value is also based on a number of assumptions about the real world and on some statistical technicalities which are just arbitrarily chosen. But the whole world relies on it. When you do these tests for vaccines, etc., and tests for medicines, you are relying on this statistical analysis. Doctors just take it for granted. They don't have the training in statistics to do it themselves. So they are told that, okay, this drug helps to cure this disease. And the assertion is being made on the basis of p-values. But it may be that these p-values were deceptive. So some of the examples are that at least at the time that it was introduced, cardiac bypass surgery was no more effective than change of diet, and the 5-year survival rates for both were about the same. For with surgery or without surgery were the same, but it was being strongly recommended by doctors. Similarly, it seems likely that salt has nothing to do with blood pressure, but it is widely believed on the basis of some statistical tests. Everybody thinks that if you have high blood pressure, you should lower your salt intake, and so on. So basically, these wrong p-values have led to and continue to lead to massively wrong prescriptions about what you should be doing and what should not be doing. The same p-values are also responsible for publications. I mean, your article, for a very long time, you couldn't publish your article unless you had a significant p-value. So a lot of people would just fiddle their results to get a strong p-value in order to be published. So again, there's another problem. And techniques for fiddling with p-values are known. I mean, we know how to make a p-value come out significant even when it is not.
So this thing about fiddling the results, I think is important to kind of explain how that happens. I think what you mentioned earlier about the data fitting a number of narratives and therefore you having freedom to choose how you analyze that data based on your choice of narrative may give you flexibility to fiddle around with it until you get a p-value that is acceptable for publication and saying, yes, that's what I'll go with.
Right. There's actually an example that was actually done. Somebody took 20 people and he fed them all chocolate, and he took another 20 who were not given chocolate. And then he monitored all of their health, blood pressure, heart rate, this, that, and the other. And he found one criteria on which all of the chocolate eating people improved. I don't remember what it was, but this is actually available in the books if you look it up. And so you prove that chocolate helps you lower blood pressure. Why? It just happened that of the 1,000 medical symptoms that you measured, one of them turned out that all 20 people were good. And the chocolate eating group were better than those who did not have any chocolate. So there you prove that that's actually exactly what a p-value is. It will tell you that if you run that, it will give you a very strong p-value and say this, chocolate significantly helps lower blood pressure. So that's how you fiddle with the p-values.
You quote Joanne Robinson's quote about the purpose of studying economics is not to be deceived by economists. And despite your very strong criticisms of econometrics, you've written a textbook on it. And I believe your quote was that the purpose of studying econometrics is not to be deceived by econometrics. Would you advise people out there to, despite its flaws, still take the time to understand and unpack these theories?
I think that one needs to study econometrics as an outsider and not as an insider. And that there's a difference in the sense that once we understand that econometrics is being used to deceive people, you don't need to study how people do things. I mean, I myself studied in depth the assumptions that are made and the calculations that are done. But now when I teach econometrics courses, I say that, okay, something is done with the numbers. We don't need to worry about that. Just take the numbers and feed it to the computer and it will output the results. What I want to study is what we do with the results, how we understand, how econometricians understand these results, how they are interpreted, how they are used for policy, and why they are wrong, and how you can argue against them, and how you can produce alternatives, different types of analysis which will lead to different types of policies and different types of actions. So this can be done without understanding what is going on inside the package. So basically, the typical econometrics course tells you the theory which went into building the software package which you utilize. And I say you can chuck all that theory out of the garbage. You can put it into the black box. That there is this computer black box. You feed in these numbers and you get this output. And econometricians have some theories which tell us that this number is to be interpreted like this, and this one is to be interpreted like this. This one is significant, that one is not significant, etc. And so I would teach students how to understand the language econometricians use and how to do a rebuttal, how to say that, okay, econometrician claims that this data proves that this is true. Now, suppose you wanted to argue against them in their own language. So what should you do? So I would say that, okay, why don't you take this particular data series and replace it by another one? and then see what the results look like. And I would try to explain how you can have the maximum impact. That is how you understand enough about what's inside the black box to understand why the econometrician is getting the result that he is and how you can change things around to get a different result.
Before we wrap up, Professor Zaman, could you tell our listeners where they should go to stay current with your work? Because I know that you've really got an open access economics course out there on the internet. So please go for it. Tell us where to stay current with your work.
I have a couple of blogs. There's a YouTube channel. I have the pedagogy blog. I have an Islamic worldview blog. But really, if there's a final message that I would like to give an audience, I would say that our education, and this is based on my personal experiences, teaches us how to be human resource and not how to learn how to be a human being. And this is a great tragedy. We have a very short life to live, and without discussing what should the purpose of my life be, how can I lead the richest and fullest life, how can I achieve the hidden capacities which are buried in my soul. These are the important questions. They are never discussed. And because they are never discussed in our education, we tend to believe, we are basically implicitly trained to believe that they are not important or that everyone can work them out. But these are really questions which are worth engaging with deadly seriousness with all our work and effort. Life is not about eating and drinking, which is what economics tells you, that it's all about maximizing consumption. It's much more meaningful, and it would be tragic to end this life and never learn its meaning. In fact, on my blog, I have a post called Learn Who You Are, and basically it tells us that education is meant to rob us of our identities, and we have to invest time and effort to regain an understanding of who we really are, what we are meant to be, what we can become. And these questions we are discouraged from, because if we try to explore the answers, we won't be good functioning parts in the capitalist machine for production of wealth. So that's really the message that I would like to give to my audience.
That's great.
That's wonderful.
I genuinely hope we get to talk again, Professor Zaman. But for now, that's a great place to leave it. We've been talking to Professor Asad Zaman, economist, writer, teacher, and more importantly, human. And we'll link to where people can stay current with your work in the show notes. But for now, thanks again for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Professor Asad Zaman.
You're most welcome, and thank you for inviting me.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.